Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Marc Law, who is Professor of Economics at the University of Vermont. His research focuses on the causes and consequences of product quality regulation, with specific focus on food, drug, advertising, and occupational licensing laws. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you for having me, Gill.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your older papers,
Sure.
History, Institutions, and Cities, a View from the Americas. You say, every nation formally or informally defines this and establishes the lines of political and fiscal authority among its national, regional, and local governments. Historically, centralized governments tend to restrict the power and autonomy of provisional and local governments. And you're exploiting in this paper that kind of control, what it does to organizations, cities, growth, urbanism, and those types of things, right?
Yes.
Intuitively, I would not have thought there is a connection there, but it's a fascinating connection.
Yes. Well, it's an interesting project that this is joint work with Suk Kim at Washington University, right? And so in the literature on urban economics, right, there's a big question about, well, what determines urban development across countries, right? And what determines why some places have very large cities and a lot of very small ones, and whereas some other places the distribution of city sizes is somewhat more equal, right? And so economic explanations for city formation, right, they generally point to what are called agglomeration economies, right? This idea that when the reason that cities form is that when people are geographically proximate, that improves their productivity, right? Because it allows for better matching, it allows for specialization, and so on and so forth, right? So that's the usual story for why cities kind of form in economics, right? So a good example of that is like, well, why are a lot of the tech jobs all in Silicon Valley, right? Well, it's because of the agglomeration effects and so forth, right? However, it's interesting to observe that if you look across countries, right, the distribution of city sizes varies a lot, and it also is sort of sometimes related to whether or not the political systems are highly centralized or more decentralized, right? And so what my co-author and I wanted to explore was whether sort of different patterns of federalism across different countries in the Americas, so North America and South and Central America, whether that can go some distance towards explaining sort of distributions of cities across different countries. And go ahead. Yes.
And so you're finding a connection between federalism and cities and city sizes and the distribution?
Yes. So the idea is basic. So you have some countries where, for historical reasons, they're very politically centralized, right? So quite often in these countries, you have what you call sort of, if you look at the distribution of city sizes, there's what's called urban primacy, right? There's one or two cities that sort of dominate the urban landscape. They account for the bulk of the population, right? And quite often they are political capitals, okay?
Right.
In other countries, you have very large cities, but they not necessarily political capitals, right? And in fact, you have a sort of more even distribution of city sizes, okay? And often these are more decentralized countries, okay? And so what we wanted to do is try to look sort of historically over time at different types of federalisms in different countries. So some countries are actually federal in the sense that you have national government as well as sub-regional governments, and then you have city governments, right? Whereas other countries are very unitary, right? There's just a national government and then there are cities below it. Okay.
Right.
So across these different, within federalisms, you have some federalisms that are highly centralizing and others that are more decentralized, right? And so we wanted to see if there was a story that could be told about how these evolving patterns of federalism affected the distribution of city sizes across Americas. So the sort of, I think the sort of basic stylized facts is if you sort of estimate the distribution, the distribution parameters for city sizes over time, what you find is that in Latin America, where basically governments were highly centralizing, okay, you generally have very concentrated city distribution. So one or two cities that are very, very large relative to everything else, right? And those tend to be political capitals, right? In contrast, in North America, and specifically in Canada and the United States, right, what you see is far more decentralized distributions of city sizes, right? So city sizes are not as unequal, okay? And in fact, even between Canada and the United States, what you see is in the United States, city size distributions tend to be more equal than in Canada, okay? And what we're trying to do in the context is to try to trace sort of historically what's going on with federalism in these countries, to try to see if it can explain these differing patterns across countries and over time. Right?
Yeah.
So the basic story I think we have in mind is as follows, right? So highly politically centralized countries, right? They are often countries where the capital city is the largest city, right? And I think that tends to mean that a lot of resources get captured by these cities, probably above and beyond what would happen just as a natural result of urban agglomeration, right? So because bureaucracies tend to be in these cities, they become centers of lobbying, right, which in turn generates economic activity and so on and so forth, right? And so in those places, political capitals tend to be very, very, very large, right?
And if you're centralized that way, to get anything done, you have to go
absolutely right. Historically, right, when in a world of high transportation costs, high transaction costs, right, essentially communication costs, basically you have to be in the city, right? So if you take a country like, for instance, Argentina, right, where Buenos Aires is by far the largest place, right, and any other city is much, much, much smaller, right? You have this concentration of economic and political activity in Buenos Aires, and it's very striking that historically in Argentina, right, although a lot of the wealth was generated out in the provinces, right, there were big landowners in the Pampas and so on and so forth that had very productive farms and so forth, right, they all basically lived in Buenos Aires, right, and so it became sort of an economic center for that very reason, because it was this nexus of political activity, right. In contrast, right, in North America, where political powers tend to be a bit more decentralized, right, especially in the United States, right, overwhelmingly, right, in US states, for instance, the largest city, with some exceptions, the largest city is generally not the political capital, right? So if you think about like California, for instance, the largest cities are, it's like Los Angeles and then San Francisco in terms of metropolitan areas, right? But really, that's and Sacramento, which is the political capital, is much, much smaller, right?
It's the same for Illinois, New
Absolutely.
York, and
Absolutely, right, with one or two exceptions, right? There are, of course, some states like Boston is the capital of Massachusetts, and of course, is also the largest city, right? But overwhelmingly, the capitals are distinct from the largest economic center, right? And I think this has to do with the fact that U.S. states, right, are actually not all that powerful, right, relative to the cities within them. Okay, so if the states were, in fact, by design, were often placed in the middle of nowhere, right? If you actually want to sort of predict where the capital of a state is, the best way to do so is to choose the geographic center of the state, right? You kind of look at the map, right, and you look at where all the capitals are in each state. It's usually somewhere in the middle, and by design, it was not supposed to be an economically important place, because I think there was a deliberate decision in Americas to keep political and economic power fairly separate. Okay. This isn't so the contrast that we really exploit, of course, because we have the most data on it and we have the most information about the evolving natures of those federalisms, is between Canada and the United States, right? Because although Canada is a fairly decentralized country, it's decentralized to provinces, but within provinces are highly centralized, right? So in most Canadian provinces, the largest city is also a capital, right? So Toronto is by far the largest city in Ontario and is also the capital of Ontario, right? And it turns out that if you kind of look at the revenue-raising power of cities versus the provinces, right, in the Canadian context, provinces have this ability to raise money that cities do not, right? In contrast, in the United States, actually, the tax space available to cities is much greater than than is available to Canadian cities, right? U.S. cities often can levy. There's a very large market for municipal debt in the United States, right? For instance, so cities can borrow, whereas in Canada that almost doesn't exist. By design, provinces are very powerful relative to cities, and so therefore Canadian provinces tend to have fairly unequal city size distributions relative to U.S. states.
Right. And so this is not in the paper, Mark, but I was wondering, from a design perspective, yes, what do you think is more efficient?
Well, that's a good question, right? I mean, I think that's of course, that is the $1 million question that we're interested in, right? To what extent is this a drag, right, on economic activity, right? The fact that so what you would worry about, right, is that because all of these political resources are flowing to these cities, they're not going to the places where actually economically they make the most sense, right? So there might be some inefficiency associated with that. And other urban economists have tried to sort of estimate this in different ways. And some, and there's some evidence that there is loss. We don't directly do that ourselves, right? But there is some evidence from other studies which suggests that this perhaps, this excessive centralization in a few places results in starving the hinterlands, right, of economic resources. Anecdotally, I can say that, in the Canadian context, I think you do sort of see this in certain ways, right? In the Canadian context, for instance, I having grown up in northern British Columbia, which was always complaining that all the resources went to Vancouver and Victoria, and they never went up to the north where I was growing up. But the complaint was that, because when I was growing up, if you were a banker in Prince George, you had to go to Vancouver, right, if you wanted to actually get a substantial loan, right? And, it was too far away from them. They kind of ignored them. And so they felt that they were starved of financial capital as a result. Okay. So Those would be the kind of inefficiencies that I think might manifest themselves as a result of this kind of centralization. But no, we don't directly estimate them.
Yes. Yeah, I was just thinking, and I can't remember all the states in India, yes, for example, they tend to be sort of one extreme part of the state. And so unlike Illinois, where Springfield is sort of at the center, yes, you see these large cities where, it's also capitals, but it's in one, yes, corner of the state. And I wonder what caused that.
Yes, well, I think, so I haven't investigated the Indian context, right, and I think, yeah, it's ultimately, you sort of, if you really want to tease this out, you sort of have to know something about how these cities were selected, right, at the time, right? I think were they, so one reason, right, historically, why I think that, some places the capitals are the largest, because the capitals were just the biggest centers were made the capitals, right, after the fact, right? And I don't know what the story is in the Indian context, right? However, I could very well believe in the Indian case that, even conditional on that, right, nevertheless, that there are great benefits to being close to the capital, given the nature of all the bureaucracy that arises, right, and the need to get permits. I think of the license Raj, now mostly dismantled, I think, but still existing in some form, right, and how it was so important to be able to be close to the capital in order to get things done, right.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, in some sense, I think you mentioned this in the paper, when agriculture was dominant, cities might have been selected based on that idea. So it's not necessarily sort of geometric center from a transaction cost perspective, but really that is where the agriculture powerhouses were, so to speak. And then it shifted. Right, when technology came in, when manufacturing came in, it went to completely different place.
Well, I think
and
that's
so
right. I think that's absolutely true. You think of much of the United States was agriculture was originally politically important in a lot of the United States, right? Absolutely. So it was important to put these capitals and centers where there was agriculture, right? But however, it has absolutely with time it has evolved. It has evolved differently.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating connection. Obviously, has some implications for policy for countries if they really want to, go back and study what might be more optimal.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's. I find this particular project. I at the time when I was working on it, I thought it was great fun, right? Because it was an opportunity to learn a lot about countries and their histories and so on and so forth. It was also in ways the most frustrating, right? Because there is so much about what one would would be nice is to have more randomization in a sense, right? That would allow us to say something cleaner about what's driving what in a way, right? And that's why ultimately I point out that you really have to have a good story about how these capitals are chosen, right? If capitals just happen to be chosen in the same places where were economically important, then it's very hard to know that if it's my story versus some other story, right? It could very well be these would have been the big cities anyway, right? So that's a sense where we're hoping that if you could look over, that's partly the story why we think it's important to take this temporal dimension, right, and this Canada-U.S. comparison that we're trying to take advantage of, right, because there you have other changes going on that may have tipped the favor, the balance one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, the other question is, as technology changes, as you mentioned, the transaction costs continue to decline. It might be that, if you were to start a new country today, it's going to be distributed decision making, and so this idea that you have, sort of centralization, from a decision making perspective, that whole idea might go away.
Well, it's hard to say, right? I mean, until this pandemic, right? I think most people would have said everything would have been centralized, right? One of the complaints that is heard in Canada, for instance, is that our cities are not large enough, right? For instance, right? That because the population is spread out, although it is fairly concentrated, right? I mean, if you look at the map of Canada and you look at densities, of course, all the density is in a handful of places, right? But it has sometimes been argued that in fact it's still inefficiently not dense enough, right? That we would benefit from greater density because of the benefits of agglomeration, right? I think these agglomeration economies are enormous, right? That certainly is the received wisdom in a lot of urban economics, right? However, right, given the pandemic, I think there has been some rethink of that, but I don't know if that's a one-off thing or it's going to, result in fundamental changes.
Right. Yeah, so that's sort of a minimum efficient scale question.
Absolutely.
And Canada's a good example because you got so much space. And the question is, again, from an efficiency perspective, how would you design that?
Absolutely, right. And I think I would be willing to bet that, again, this is just me thinking off the top of my head, right? But if it weren't for certain borders that are existing, certain Canadian cities would probably be much smaller, right? If imagine that we didn't have a border at the 49th parallel, and that Canada and the United States were a single country, right? It raises the question of, well, would Toronto be as significant as it is, right? Right? Or would everything have gravitated to, I don't know, Chicago and New York and so on and so forth, right? Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
In the European context, right? You have, if you look at a lot of Europe, for instance, you have very small countries, right? And like a country like Germany has a lot of cities, but none of them are like super big, right? And I think that is a function of the fact that Germany was once many countries, right? And it was politically fragmented, right? And so therefore, in much of Central Europe, right, you have a lot of cities that are kind of, of moderate size, right, in some ways, right? And had it always been centralized, then maybe the city size distribution would look very different, right?
Right. Yeah, I want to jump into one of your recent papers, Understanding the Rise of Regulation During the Progressive Era. What role for Austrian economics, you ask? So you say that you selectively survey the economic history literature of the rise of regulation in America during the Progressive Era with the goal of identifying how this literature is informed by Austrian economic theory. So can you give a quick definition for Austrian economic theory?
So I don't pretend to be an Austrian economic theorist, but I was invited to write this paper for part of a symposium that was being organized. Basically the organizers were asking economic historians like myself, who are not Austrians, right, to sort of think about to what extent Austrian insights might offer, in economic history, and whether economic history provides some way of testing different Austrian ideas, right? As I come at it, right, again, I'm not an expert on Austrian economics myself, but as I come at it, what I see as being the sort of the key difference between a lot of Austrian thinking and sort of mainstream economic thinking is that mainstream economic thinking is mostly about equilibrium, right? It's about, it's kind of developed off this sort of Newtonian type thinking, right? Very 18th century logic, right? When we think about markets in equilibrium, right? And prices playing this role in coordinating us and bringing markets into equilibrium, okay? Austrian economics, in contrast, is more about process, right? I think a lot of it is about how we get to equilibrium, right? And there have been many different, contributions that they've made on this score, right? But I think so. So because it's about this process, there's a lot more concern about sort of dynamics, right? How do we move from one point to another, right? As well as on the individual actors who move us towards equilibrium, who are the entrepreneurs, right? So I thought, I would try to explore to what extent those insights are borne out and could be fruitful for the study of the economic history of regulation.
And so you talk about two things here. One is, as you mentioned, sort of the dynamics of the system and dynamics of how regulation evolves in that. And then the one is sort of the role of entrepreneurship within that system. How does that affect, right? So what is your conjecture here?
I think that Austrian economics can tell us about both of those things, right? So on the dynamic story, right? So when economists typically study the economics of regulation, we look at basically one regulation at a time. How does it arise? Who wins and who loses, and what effect did the regulation have on the allocation of resources, right? So there tends to be mostly an emphasis on the static gains and losses of regulation, right? And I think that's a very fruitful format for thinking about why particular regulations evolve and who wins and loses and what it does. Okay. But of course, regulation, once it's enacted, doesn't just stay still, right? Typically, once a regulation is introduced, it basically creates new interests, right, that arise in order to take advantage or avoid those regulations, right? And these new interests, in turn, form a new nexus of lobbyists, essentially, right, who then sort of push regulation in one direction or the other, right? And so really regulation isn't a story of it just coming and staying stagnant, right? But instead it sort of evolves over time in this particular way, okay? And so one conjecture is that this dynamic approach, right, maybe will allow us to get a better understanding of sort of how different regulatory agencies evolved over time in the terms of what they regulate, how they regulate, and so forth, right? So if you take, for instance, the regulation of food and drugs, right? So food and drug regulation begins in the late 19th century, and it's really not about drugs at all. It's about food, right? And it's about something fairly narrow. It's about basically food labeling laws, right? And that's sort of how sort of early state pre-FDA type organizations, I guess you could call them, right? State regulators of food labels sort of emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century. And ultimately, that's what gave rise to what we now call the FDA, right? Which was originally in the Department of Agriculture, right? Pharmaceuticals was kind of a sideline, right? It wasn't, of course, there wasn't really a big pharmaceutical industry at this time, right? The FDA was, its predecessor came about in about 1906, right, as a result of the 1906 Pure Food and Drugs Act. And drugs was sort of added in as an extra thing, right? It sort of got thrown into the mix, right? Because there was a bit of concerns about, because again, the concern was about labeling, was that, if pharmaceuticals are being sold to people, then we've got to make sure that, of course, that they also meet the same standards of accuracy and labeling, right? And that's sort of how it emerged, right? There was no concern about safety or efficacy initially, right? However, that came about later, right? Once the FDA sort of gained some authority over this, right, then, of course, there became an interest in using it, right, to do something else, right? And so there's sort of the evolution of now, and today we think of the Food and Drug Administration as really mostly about pharmaceuticals, right? Food is certainly part of what they do, but the headline is always drug approval, right, and so forth, right? And so how did we get from just sort of narrowly, focusing on product labels to actually, the extensive pre-market lab testing and so on and so forth of pharmaceuticals that we have today, right? And so the hope is that this sort of Austrian story, which tells us something about the interest groups that are involved and how they come about, and then change the nature of regulation over time, that might inform us something about the evolution of those regulations.
You talk, you have another paper, How Do Regulators Regulate Enforcement of the Pure Food and Drugs Act. You talk about in that paper sort of the signaling mechanism, right? Certification, quality, and so people worry about, sometimes, was it sort of put together by dominant firms to get an advantage, or did it actually add, social welfare by allowing more competition and more firms to come into the market? What did you find there?
What I was trying to investigate there is that so the FDA in its original form was a pretty small agency, right? There weren't a lot of people who worked at it. It was actually, at the time, it was called the Bureau of Chemistry, which was this unit within the Department of Agriculture. Okay, so they were tasked with trying to enforce this Pure Food and Drugs Act. Okay, and initially, the way they tried to do it was essentially through the court system, right? They sort of sample products, test them, right, and see if they were accurately labeled or not, right? And then they would try to take them to court. Okay, so that was essentially the process in which they wanted to sort of enforce this law, right? It was sort of through deterrence, as it were. Okay, we'll punish you if you mislabel your goods, right? Okay. Pardon me?
All
exactly.
ex post compliance.
Right? Okay, the threat of ex post punishment, the hope was that would induce food manufacturers to be accurate. Okay. However, that proved to be a very ineffective mechanism, right? Because it was actually pretty easy for these firms to evade the court system, right? The court system was slow and kind of cumbersome, right? The law didn't give them the ability to impose particularly punitive fines, right? So it was, even if they got punished, it was fairly nominal, right? And so they quickly sought other ways of getting getting this enforcement done. And so what they basically came upon was they basically developed them. They sort of were able to leverage the fact that they were experts, right, in sort of food science and food chemistry. These were the guys who were originally in the FDA, right? And they were able to basically say, look, we can help certify your goods, essentially, right? A stamp of approval from us, right, basically is possibly a useful market signal for you, right? And that would allow you to, distinguish yourself from, so if it has a stamp of approval, then that means potentially you can charge a higher price for a product, right? That was, I think, probably their thinking, right? And eventually it also, and so it allowed you to signal quality, right? And that, I think, facilitated the development of a lot of manufactured foods, right? There was naturally a lot of skepticism about many of these products. They were new. Think about canned goods and so on and so forth, right? During this time, these were relatively unfamiliar products, right? And consumers were wary of them, right? And so having this stamp of approval from the FDA proved to be a fairly useful signal for a lot of food manufacturers, which I think allowed this industry to sort of take off.
And so what you mean by Austrian economics effects here is really sort of regulation evolving from multiple forces.
Exactly, evolving as a result of, well, in this case, right, as a result of essentially entrepreneurial activity, but not on the part, in this case, of firms, right? When we think of entrepreneurship, we normally think of owners of businesses, right, as being the entrepreneurs, right? And entrepreneurs in the Austrian context are basically these individuals who are able to use their very specific knowledge to find profit opportunities, right? They can see that there's a new product that might be needed here, that there's an innovation that would allow them to reduce costs and improve quality and so forth, right? Those are the entrepreneurs, and they are these searching people, right, who are able to identify these profit opportunities, right? The point, I guess, so if you're kind of thinking of these two articles kind of combined, right, is essentially what I identify in this piece where I was writing for this Austrian conference is that you can think of the early FDA as being kind of entrepreneurs also, except entrepreneurs in the bureaucracy, right? They're trying to make their jobs work, right? They're trying to leverage their expertise over food science, food technology, or whatever, right? To do some to fulfill their regulatory ambitions, right? Which is to improve the quality of foods and so forth, right? So this is a case where that sort of entrepreneurship works out. I think during this time, again, I don't want to say much out of sample, right? But in this particular instance, it works, I think, to the social benefit because it also allows for the development of new products.
Yeah, so if I understand this correctly, Mark, in some sense, the regulators moved upstream, that they could provide guidance, they could provide expertise to the manufacturers, and rather than become exposed compliance managers, they could actually drive.
That's exactly correct. Yes.
Is that how you see it?
The reason I call this entrepreneurialism on their part is that there was no directive that they do this, right? They were just told, enforce this law, right? And then they had to come up with some way of doing it, okay? So the entrepreneurship is in inventing this mechanism for themselves, right? They initially tried the way that would seem obvious, right? Is to sort of be a policeman about it, right? Is go over and catch the bad guys, find the adulterators and so forth, okay? But they just didn't find that was very effective. And so rather than continue to do that, right, they said, well, let's innovate, right? Let's do something useful for firms that allows us to actually enforce this law more effectively.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to think about regulation. We'll take a quick break, Mark. When we come back, we'll talk about your other regulation. Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So, Mark, we are back. We were talking about regulation as sort of a dynamic process of regulation, how it evolves, how entrepreneurs and market forces might shape it over time. And you have done a lot of work in this area of regulation on many different areas. To start with one of your papers, so the political economy of truth in advertising.
Right.
So truth in advertising regulation. So when did it start?
It starts in the early decades of the 20th century, right? So I think yes, in the 1900s, right?
Yeah.
And then it sort of goes through until about the 1940s, right? So at the state level, individual states enacted these sort of truth in advertising laws, right? Which basically gave authorities some ability to go after manufacturers or producers who sort of lied about their products in various ways.
Right. And cynically one might, so since advertising is costly, cynically one might think that big firms might have an incentive here to do this. But you could also think about if this is, like you mentioned before, provides a signal of quality to the market, it actually allows other firms to benefit from it. So what do you find from the data?
Well, so as you sort of hinted, right, we're kind of looking at two different hypotheses for why these laws arose, right? Okay, so in the study of regulation, typically there's always sort of two competing hypotheses. One is what we may call a public interest story, where regulation is introduced in some ways to make markets work better, right, to improve efficiency. And there's always some sort of special interest story where, well, maybe the regulations are not being introduced to help markets work better, but they're being introduced to advantage one segment of the market at the expense of the other, right? So in the context of this set of regulations, right, so one story you could tell, right, is that truth in advertising laws were essentially introduced to basically make it costly for smaller firms, right, who didn't have large budgets and so forth, to advertise, right? Advertising is a way of communicating information about your product, right, to your customers, right? That's the point of advertising. It's a way of signaling quality, right, communicating aspects of attributes of your product and so on and so forth. And so it's a very useful competitive device, right?
Yeah.
And so one story you could tell is that what you want is large firms perhaps wanted these laws in order to make it costly for their smaller competitors to advertise, right? That's one possible story. Okay. A second possible story is that, and this is actually one that I think we believe to be more consistent with the historical evidence, is that the reason that these laws were sought after, right, was because in an environment where there was sort of no regulation at all of advertising, okay, the credibility of advertising was sort of put into question, right? This is called at the time they called this the rotten apple hypothesis, right? For why they needed regulation, right? So the story was that ads were going to be people could be potentially untruthful. It was very costly for people to ascertain whether or not all ads whether a particular ad was true or not, right?
Then using sort of the size of the firm as a proxy for quality in the absence of such a regulation?
Well, this story suggests that in fact all firms would have this particular story, right, sort of is that, well, given that advertising is potentially deceptive, right, then that basically it's like the quality of advertising as a whole, its truthfulness is a public good, right? And it will be undersupplied, right? Because if one firm sort of starts says, well, is a little bit less than truthful about its advertising, right? Well, then that sort of diminishes the credibility of all advertising. Okay?
Right.
That's sort of the idea. And so advertising, if it's all a bunch of lies, I guess here's the simple way of explaining it, right? If it's all a bunch of lies, then basically nobody will ever believe any advertising, right? Okay.
Right.
And so having these truth in advertising laws was a way of shoring up confidence in advertising, right? I think that's I think a better way of explaining this hypothesis. Okay.
Right. And so you in some sense you take a inferior good,
Yes,
advertising, and make it better for the entire society, so to speak.
yes, exactly. Well, so the idea is that by regulating the quality of advertising, the claims made in advertising become more credible. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, that's right. So the way we tried to test these hypotheses was to basically look at the volume of advertising that was actually in newspapers and magazines, which were at this time still the principal source of advertising. Right?
Yeah.
Radio was, it was somewhat later, and of course television well after this period. Okay, and basically the two hypotheses basically have differing predictions about what should happen to the volume of advertising. Right, if in fact it's this anti-competitive, if this regulation is meant to benefit a few companies at the expense of every, and to reduce, to make, if the goal of it is to reduce access to advertising, right, which is the sort of special interest story, then you'd expect that with the introduction of these laws, the volume of advertising would decline, right? In contrast, if it was the point of the laws was to actually improve the credibility, right, then we would expect the volume of advertising to increase. Yeah. And that's actually what we observe, right? Is that in fact there's adjusting for sort of market size of each state. As a state introduces one of these laws, the volume of advertising went up, right? Which we think is more consistent with the story of advertising improving, these regulations improving advertising's credibility than it actually serving as an anti-competitive device.
I know that this data might be difficult to get, but I wondered, is there some sort of a relationship between the size of the firm and the volume of advertising that was?
Well, you've got to imagine larger firms, of course, did a lot more advertising. That's certainly true. Yes, I think the clean, if you wanted to think about, well, what would be a cleaner test of this hypothesis, right, would probably be to look at the price of advertising space, right? So if advertising, in fact, became more valuable as a result of its credibility improving, then, in fact, its price should go up, right? Okay. It should become, because it's more valuable, okay? However, we don't observe that kind of data, right, of what they were charging for advertising space. What we can observe is volumes of advertising.
Right. And so your conclusion here is that the advertising regulation seemed to have done a benefit.
Yes.
To society, right? Essentially, it allowed the quality of advertising to increase, and it allowed firms of all sizes to advertise.
That's right. That's sort of our story. Is that this has helped making the market for advertising work more efficiently in that way, right? By sort of providing some basic policing of advertising claims, right? It basically allowed advertising to be more credible, and it allowed this market to work better, right?
Right. You have another idea here, another paper, Mark, Effects of Occupational Licensing Laws on Minorities.
Yes.
Sort of a similar question. So in the paper investigates the effect of occupational licensing regulation on the representation of minority workers in a range of skilled and semi-skilled occupations.
Yes.
So again, there are some suggestions that these licensing laws basically give advantages to the status quo, the incumbent, and increases entry barriers for new entrants, right? So what do you find here?
Well, so this is a classic question in the literature on occupational licensing, right? Essentially, is licensing a way of reducing competition, right, and sort of increasing incomes of the licensed practitioners, right? Or is licensing provide information about quality, right? That's sort of the central question in a lot of the occupational licensing literature. Is it purely an entry restriction, right? Or does it actually provide some method of quality assurance? Okay. Right. So during this period, so again, as you I think you're discovering, like a lot of this work is about, a lot that I've done is about sort of the origins of these regulations in this sort of late 19th, early 20th century, right? And so during this time, not only were states introducing laws about advertising, right, and food and so forth, but they were also introducing laws that began to regulate different occupations, right? So you have this sort of scattered adoption of licensing laws across states over time in the late decades of the 19th century up through the middle of the 20th century. Okay. And so it's widely believed that these laws were anti-competitive, right? That they reduced competition, right? Okay. And it's also believed, and I think it's true in some instances, that these laws were also used to keep out certain demographic groups, right? So that licensing of certain occupations was not so much maybe a way of assuring people of quality, but was more about reducing competition and keeping out Blacks and women and so on and so forth. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the sort of the received wisdom. And again, I think it is true in many instances that licensing has served that kind of function. Okay. However, what we wanted to do is we wanted to look across a sort of a broader range of occupations that represented a reasonably large percentage of the licensed workforce during this time. Okay. I think we looked at, I don't know, 8 or 9 occupations. I can't remember how many in total. Okay. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to see if these licenses had a disproportionate impact on female workers and Black workers, right? So were they harmed or they hurt by the introduction of these licensing laws over time, right? And we find kind of an interesting, sort of a nuanced story here, right? So in certain occupations where essentially it's not obvious that you would need a license to signal quality, right? In those occupations, I think it's probably safe to say that these regulations either had very little effect, because maybe they just weren't very effective, okay? At this time, they weren't very binding, perhaps, right? Or they may have actually disadvantaged women and minorities, okay? So, for instance, in the barbering profession, right? Barbering is an occupation that's licensed, right? But it's actually unclear that there's a lot of need for licensing, right? It's pretty easy to figure out who's a good barber, right? It's not, the market can sort that out pretty easily. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. You can quickly see if you got
a bad haircut, you just don't go back, right? And I think that, that and reputation is enough to ensure that, good barbers get rewarded and bad barbers don't, okay? And in those occupations, there's certainly no benefit to minorities and women, right? Well, of course, back then it was all men who were barbers, right? And in fact, there's some evidence that Blacks were harmed by these laws, okay, in those occupations. However, in other occupations where there were more skill involved, right? So in higher skilled occupations, like I think we have, like doctors or maybe plumbers or pharmacists, I think those were some of the ones we looked at. What we found was that there's actually some evidence there that women and minorities may have actually been helped by those licenses, right? That they may have actually allowed them to enter occupations which they would normally have been kept out of, right? And so the story here is perhaps that what's going on is in many of these services, right, for which there's fairly high skill, there might have at this time been what we call statistical discrimination, right? This sort of idea that, well, I'm not going to go to, let's say during this time, you might not go to a female doctor, right? Because people just didn't think that women could do it, okay? That might have been a prevalent view at that time, okay? And so what a license allowed a woman or a Black person at this time to do is to signal that they actually that they were going to be qualified to operate in these occupations, right? And so we think that in these higher skilled occupations, the story is somewhat different, because here, this was an opportunity for licensing to actually serve as a signal of quality that allowed these minority groups and women to prove their mettle.
Yeah, so I wonder, Mark, so the higher skilled occupations, the earning power is higher. And the negative story has to be valid. the entrants have to have some sort of capital constraint. But if your earning power is higher, presumably, you can borrow and you can get licensed. Whereas the haircutting profession, the earnings power is lower. You do have that problem. Is that the way to think about it, or you don't find any evidence for?
We don't directly connect this with information about the income of the professionals, right? So during this time, they weren't collecting data on wages or anything of that sort, right? So I can't tell you precisely what the empirical relationship would have been in this period, right? However, yes, I think in a sense, right, certain occupations, of course, are higher income occupations, in part because they are licensed, right? Because there is protected entry, right? And so one story that is told is that, well, the reason that you need these licenses is because essentially by keeping the earning power high, and I'm not saying that this is empirically true, it's just one story that is told, right? But that by restricting entry, right, you're facilitating the formation, you're giving these guys an incentive to form very specific human capital, right? Exactly. Right. Because I know that when I'm in that occupation, my wages are not going to be competed away, and so that gives me an incentive to accumulate the skills, right, that are necessary to operate in those occupations, right? So that is sometimes a story foretold for why we might want licensing, right? The licensing literature is big, and it's, of course, licensing is empirically today it's pretty widespread, right? Something between 20 to 30% of U.S. workers are subject to a license, right? And it's probably gone too far, I think, right? There's a lot of occupations where you have to have a license where it's really unclear why you need one, right? And I think a lot of it is simply just some effort to reduce competition, right? So this sort of informational story, I think, is an important one, and it's relevant. And I think there are still many instances where it allows people to signal quality, but it's certainly not the only one, nor do I think it's the predominant story for why we have licensing.
Yeah, I wondered, Mark, that the most of the licensing that we see is sort of binary in the sense that you cannot practice without the license. Having the license doesn't really say anything about the quality of services delivered. It's almost like, a ticket to play.
It's an entry, right? Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's not that, you might have been able, maybe you had to pass an exam at some point, right? That was involved perhaps, right? But then beyond that, well, of course, to maintain the license, sometimes you have to do some continuing education, right? So physicians and so forth are required to do a certain amount of continuing ed, right, every year to maintain their licenses. So there's a little bit of that, right? But no, I agree with you. It's not really a very strong signal of ongoing quality. Yes.
Right. And so you would argue that maybe, again, from a policy perspective, you have to really look at licensing requirements by profession and really understand why it exists and what the benefits and costs are.
Right. I mean, I think there are vast numbers of occupations that probably, market forces work very well in sorting out who's good and not, right? Okay. The informational requirements of trying to figure out who's going to be a quack and who's not are pretty low. And so you would think that, you really don't need the licenses, right? If you're going to have licensing, then the question is, well, is that really the way you want to go about it, right? So licensing is probably the strictest kind of occupational regulation, in that basically it says you cannot operate without a license, right? But there are many industries where you can kind of go for sort of a weaker standard, like certification, right? Where you can have organizations that certify certain people for doing certain sort of work, but you can operate in that field without necessarily having the certification, right? And that's a more pro-competitive kind of, it provides the information, but it doesn't preclude competition.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, if the intent is to assess quality, then you have to really think about sort of sequential exams, maybe publishing scores in those exams and things like that,
absolutely, right? But that doesn't generally happen, right? I think once doctors pass their exams and they move on and they don't write those exams ever again, right? There's, they take these continuing education courses, but they're not too demanding of them, and I don't think they get really tested every now and then, right? Then essentially they're requiring on their reputation with their peers, right? To basically that's what keeps them up, right? In some ways, right? So it is kind of it's a very crude mechanism for trying to assure quality. There's no question about that.
Yeah, I also look at, think about this it's sort of a matrix. So there is an earnings power question. There is also a complexity question, which is if the customer is unable to really assess quality because the product or service delivered is so complex, then there is a need for some sort of gatekeeping there.
Exactly, right? That I think is very much the case, right? And that's, I think, where licensing or some kind of regulation has potentially a very productive role, right? Where I don't, if I don't know, when I go to the dentist, I'm not sure what, he tells me that I need this done, or I need to have a filling or whatever. Yeah. How would I know, right? There's no easy way for me to be able to test that, right? And so there, some kind of assurance is very, very useful. Right? Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, so I want to finish up with another paper you have, another very interesting paper. Did early 20th century alcohol prohibition affect mortality? And so this is prohibition in the 1900s, 1900 to 1920. Right. And you're asking, was that a good thing? So what do you find?
Basically, we're asking the question of, did it actually reduce the incidence of diseases that might have been related to excessive alcohol consumption, right? So the United States in the 19th century was awash with drink, right? Prohibition didn't arise by accident, right? It arose as a social force because there was a serious problem of heavy drinking in certain parts, certain communities of the United States. I think, settled by Northern Europeans who were often quite prone to alcoholism. Okay, it was a social menace, and it continues, of course, to be in some way. Okay, and so what we wanted to look at is, did these, so prohibition, of course, it wasn't, when we think of prohibition in popular context, we normally just think of the prohibition at the national level that occurred in 1920, right? The sort of the national level prohibition, but in fact, it was preceded by state level prohibition, and even before that, prohibition at the county level. Okay. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at a wide range of health outcomes and basically mortality counts, essentially. Okay. That might be plausibly related to excessive alcohol consumption. Okay. And we wanted to see if this gradual introduction of prohibition, first at the level of counties and then at the level of states, right, had any effect on reducing the incidence of certain types of illnesses like cirrhosis and so forth. Okay, things that are related to alcohol consumption, and even things like, of course, accidents and whatnot, right? Because of course, when you're drunk, you can also, you can kill yourself, right, by accident, or maybe you're more likely to commit suicide or something along those lines. Okay. And so a lot of the contribution of this paper is somewhat methodological in that we're not the first people to sort of look at this, okay? Other scholars have also looked at the effect of state-level prohibitions on certain health outcomes, okay? But we wanted to contribute by, looking at a larger number of outcomes than had been previously examined, okay? And also trying to improve the coding of prohibition by taking account of this sort of county level prohibition, and also to get the timing of the state level prohibition correct, because some previous studies had miscoded that. Okay, and so what we found is, if you do it as we have, that we find some evidence that in fact prohibition was good in the sense that it at least in terms of reducing the incidence of certain types of illnesses. Okay, so there are fewer deaths due to I think certain liver diseases, right? We find fewer deaths due to accidents and suicides and stuff like that. Okay, and that there was something to it, right? These laws were not just there's a widespread conception in the popular culture that prohibition just didn't work. Okay. And certainly it had a lot of costs. We're not saying that it was ultimately a good idea on a cost-benefit sense, right? We just want to know did it generate any of the benefits that it was supposed to, and what we find is, well, it seems to have, right? That it did reduce deaths due to certain types of diseases that were related to alcohol.
But if I understand correctly, Mark, so could you compute sort of the total cost of the system?
The costs of prohibition?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is the right way to look at it, but prohibition would have decreased economic activity from just consumption and production.
So we don't actually estimate the costs of prohibition, and I think so the costs of prohibition are principally in terms of the enforcement, right, of it, right. And the crime that might have resulted as a result of it, okay? Because of course there was a fair bit of evasion, right, as we know, organized crime and the rest of it, right, may have been related to that. But also, of course, simply the lost pleasure, right, from forcing taking drink away from people, right? Okay. In terms of the economic costs, well, I think it's in terms of like the reduction, it's true there would have been less alcohol production, but of course a lot of that production would have been reallocated somewhere else, right, into some other industry. But no, we don't make an effort to do that. That would be another endeavor, right? We're just trying to see if it had some effect on the mortality numbers, and it appears to have done so. Right?
Both mortality and diseases sounds like, right?
To be clear. Yes, there was fewer deaths associated with alcohol-related causes. Okay, that's right, and it was if it was an economically significant amount, so in the sense that we tried to sort of estimate using sort of the value of statistical life, how much was it worth in some ways, and it actually was not totally trivial in terms of its benefits. But of course, there were a lot of costs. I certainly wouldn't want to ignore those.
Yeah, and I also wondered, Mark, whether there is some sort of substitution effect. So, again, the place I grew up in South India had this problem just very recently, and they had a prohibition. And what they found was that there is a substitution to other drugs from alcohol, and that turned out to be a bigger problem.
That's right. I mean, that's always kind of potentially a problem, right? With if people are going to get their fix one way or the other in some ways, right? In this context, we don't actually observe that, right? It doesn't appear to have shifted mortality towards other causes. Okay, so what's interesting is that what we find is that prohibition seems to have reduced mortality due to alcohol-related diseases. Okay, but it didn't affect the mortality rates due to anything else. Okay, we sort of do that as a falsification test, right? Because what we would worry about is that well, imagine that places that had prohibition were also places where just health outcomes were improving anyway. Okay, then we would be misattributing these prohibition. We would be there'd be a confounding variable, right, in that sense. We don't want to attribute these declines to prohibition if they were in fact due to other causes. Okay. But what's interesting is we don't find decline in deaths due to any other cause, right? It doesn't affect other mortality rates in either direction. Okay, it doesn't increase them or reduce them.
So one thing I was thinking about, Mark, is that there is, 1900 to 1920 seems like a fairly short period of time. Alcohol use-related mortality takes some time to show up. So did you look at a lag between and the actual mortality?
No, we didn't. I mean, of course, yes, some of these diseases would take a long time to sort of affect, people. That's absolutely right. So I think, no, that would be a subject for future study. I mean, I think it's the problem with looking at the lags, right, is that, of course, people move around, right, during that time, right? And so it's very difficult to trace, any individual's exposure to prohibition at one period with their health outcomes many years later, right? So while that might be something that we ultimately you would like to do, that is not something we were able to do, right?
No. So in conclusion, Mark, you have done a lot of work in this area of regulation. If I understand this correctly, there are a lot of sort of misconception of the origin of regulatory laws and the effects on the population. But in general, you're finding that much of the regulations that you looked at actually had a positive effect on
Well,
society.
I think yes, that certainly one might draw that inference from this body of work, right? I mean, if to put in a larger perspective, right? I was sort of interested. What sort of motivated me to do a lot of these studies, right? So I'm very interested in the origins of the American regulatory state, right, during this early 20th century period, right? And certainly it is certainly among economists, it's widely believed that regulation mostly is a reflection of special interests, right? Who want to have regulation to advantage themselves, right? To at the expense of their competitors. That regulation is inefficient in that way, and that's sort of the received wisdom among many economists about the origins of the regulatory state. And I think my work sort of points out that, well, that may be true for some regulations. There's a lot of regulations that I haven't looked at, right? But there are certain other regulations that were arising during this time that I think were basically a response to asymmetric information problems that were arising in an increasingly complex society. Right? I think that during this period, right, that when exchange was increasingly impersonal, where products were increasingly complicated, right, where people were living in very urban environments and where you didn't really know who was making your stuff, right, and producing your foods and so on and so forth, right, that there was a lot of uncertainty about things like product quality, okay, and that regulation may have played a productive role in facilitating the expansion of markets during this time when it was not easy for people to determine whether or not products were safe or not safe.
Yeah, one complication, of course, is the regulator himself or herself.
Yes.
So the question is, are they getting the regulation? So assuming that the intent to regulate was the right one, there still remains to be a question of the design of the regulation, if they got that right.
Yes.
Right?
And ultimately,
be more and more problematic, I think, as we go forward, because things, as you say, are getting more complex.
Yes. Well, that's right. And I think, that many of these regulations sort of outlive their purpose, right? We think about all of the ways we now have to figure out some quality of things, right? We have a lot more private mechanisms, right, for signaling quality than we did back then, right? If you want to figure out what restaurant to eat at, you don't need a regulator, right? You go to Yelp or whatever, right? You have the internet. You have information is a lot more easily available, right, about many of these things, right? And so whether or not some of these regulations are still needed is an open question, or particularly whether they need to take the particular form that they do, right? Additionally, yes, over time these regulations get, they calcify and their need changes and they become captured by other interests. Right? I mean, I think the origins of the FDA, as I see it, are very, I think, probably mostly fairly good, right? I think my story is that it was helping here, making markets work, and so on and so forth, right? However, as we've seen in the last year, the FDA today is extremely clumsy, right? Right? It's been very, very slow to, approve testing and so on and so forth, right? I think a lot of the progress against this pandemic, right, has been impeded by a lot of this regulation, right? And so how did we get from regulation being good to regulation being bad in this case, right? And I think there we have to then this sort of more dynamic approach becomes very, very instructive, right? Because then it will allow us to sort of try to identify these turning points, right? In which point, how different interest groups, how do we go from one regime to another, and why is this regime that we currently have not working very well for us anymore?
Right. Yeah. So looking at it, sort of a continuous fashion, there may be, some regulations may require some sort of an expiry date for reevaluation, things like that, right?
Well, that's right. Right. Because of course they very, very seldom go away, right? generally the groups that benefit from them manage to keep them there, right? And most people don't know about it anymore, right? And it becomes a specialized industry of itself, right? To try to figure out how all of these rules work. Right? I think most people had no idea how difficult it would be to get a coronavirus test out to the market, right? And all the thicket of FDA rules and so on and so forth that would have to, or that the FDA would be so conservative, right, in this way, right?
Right.
I mean, I think historical understanding helps us understand this, right? The FDA's reputation today is as the guardian of the public, right? Of the public safety and so forth, right? The regime of extensive pre-market testing and approval, I think, is the source of people's confidence in the FDA. Okay, and so therefore, not surprisingly, they've become very, very, very cautious, right, about approving new drugs and approving new tests and so on and so forth, right? And they set this extremely high scientific standard, which may be okay if you're not in the middle of a pandemic, although even there it may be still too high. Okay,
yeah.
But it's certainly not if you need a more flexible sort of response, then it's simply a straitjacket.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Marc. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Well, thank you, Gill. It's been fun.
Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.